Hello, and welcome to Making Sense of It. I am Mona Duncan, your moderator. Do you ever wonder why you do the things you do? Then this program is for you. Making Sense of It is our gift to you from the Glasser Institute for Choice Theory. And our mission is to facilitate a world where people make responsible and respectable choices and where they build healthy relationships through the concepts of choice theory. Each week, we have a representative from the Glasser Institute to present some kind of a conundrum of life and how they have handled it effectively and have overcome, and that we can pass it on to you. Reality therapy, the concepts of, is the universal system for empowering individuals and improving relationships. And our speaker today is spoke with us last week, and we've received several positive comments from that. And it's Jeff Steedman. And today he's going to be sharing with how the use of choice theory in assisting the Indigenous Australian Aborigine community. So Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. And great to be back again.
I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mona. I'm going to issue a mea culpa at the beginning. I'm not going to say sorry because I can't do a whole lot about it, but I do have an Aussie accent, and that's the one I've got. So I'll try to enunciate my words as clearly as I can, but please forgive me if some of them seem a bit difficult for you to understand. Hopefully you can replay the thing later to try and work it out. So I want to tell you a little bit about my background, first of all, in the space of working with the Indigenous community and with myself. So I've been involved in teaching initially for about 10, 12 years. Actually, it was more like 15 years. And then I went into counselling, and I've been counselling for about 30 years, and I've been involved with Glasser and choice theory for about 20 odd years here in Australia, here down under, as we like to say. In that time, I've been living primarily where I live now in country Victoria. I live in a place called Bairnsdale, and it's about 300 kilometres from Melbourne. And Melbourne, Australia, is in Victoria, and it's on the continent of Australia. It's right down the bottom, so it's southerly. So it is quite remote. It's not a huge community. It's quite a reasonable community, but Australia is fairly sparsely populated anyway. So in terms of towns and cities, it's called a city, but it's not really. It's like a big town. In my time here, I became aware initially through my teaching that there was quite a strong Indigenous population. In this area, the Indigenous population is called the Gunai-Kurnai. So initially, I didn't know anything really about Indigenous Australians. I grew up in the city, Melbourne, and I don't know if I ever came across an Aboriginal Australian. I may have done, but I certainly don't remember that. So really my first experience was as an adult coming to the country. In my time here, I've worked for nearly 20 years with a group called Mudji Aboriginal Corporation. In Australia, we have set up individual corporations to assist Indigenous communities to self-care, and they really run these corporations themselves. The Mudji Aboriginal Corporation does a number of things. It looks after health and well-being, and that's where I come in. I've been working with them as both a counsellor, but also a consultant and a trainer, teaching them choice theory, and in particular teaching the health workers and the leadership choice theory, lead management and reality therapy, or counselling with choice theory, as we tend to do. I also work for about 5 years now with a group called LIHA, and LIHA is the Lakes Entrance Aboriginal Health Association. They don't do the difference between a health association and a corporation is that the corporation has a business arm. So the Mudgee Aboriginal Corporation, which operates out of a town called Orbost, which is 100 kilometres away from Bairnsdale. We travel distances all the time in Australia. I work there weekly, but they do the health, but they also run businesses. So they have nurseries, they grow Indigenous food, they look after the land. There's a whole range of things they do as well as health. The Lakes Entrance Aboriginal Health Association just do health and mental wellbeing. Also work with the local Bairnsdale group, which is called GJAC, Gippsland and East Gippsland Aboriginal Corporation. And another bigger, broader group, which is called GLAWAC, which is Gippsland Lands and Waters Aboriginal Corporation. And they actually look after national parks and wildlife and do a lot of hands-on work in carving trails, looking after the property, and certainly looking after the flora and fauna in those parks. And it's a really good way for them to reconnect with what in Australia they call country. The term country stands for more than land. With a Western idea, we think of country as land, but country is land, and it's inseparable from community, from spiritual belief, from history. They call it here the dream time, which is the time in the past that they remember through oral history. So there's that strong connection, and a corporation like GLAWAC does a lot to help the Indigenous community to reconnect. I work with within each of those with individual counselling, leadership training and support, critical incident support. I do staff training and support, and I also do mentoring. I'm mentoring one incredible young lady in Melbourne at the moment. As I said, it's 300 kilometres away, but we do that via Zoom. And she's in the process of completing a master's in sociology. So I'm operating as a mentor to support her in her growth, because she's one of the future leaders. In our Indigenous community, leaders are given the title of elders. You are not necessarily an elder just because you're older. You're an elder because you've earned it. You will be given a title of auntie or uncle. And if you're an auntie or uncle, then you are accepted as a leader within the Indigenous community. We also have leaders who are not elders. So people, for example, managers of the corporations may not be elders, but nevertheless are still leaders. And that's I guess, the current situation. I want to take you back to some history. Captain Cook, in the US, you may not know about Captain Cook, but Captain Cook was a British, or English actually then, explorer. Captain Cook discovered Australia in 1770. What he didn't realise, and the English people didn't realise or didn't accept, was that Australia had been discovered hundreds of thousands of years before that by the Indigenous peoples. So it wasn't new at all, but it was new to the English. And they had a particular worldview, and I know the US has had its differences in the past with the English over their dominion around the world. They had a particular worldview that said that if they discovered a place, they could then declare it as theirs. They declare possession. So Cook in 1770 declared Australia as British or English territory, claimed ownership of it. That involved no negotiation, no acceptance of the Indigenous peoples at all. He did meet the Indigenous peoples. They were quite inquisitive and amazed at the wooden ships with the billowing white flags that came through the Botany Bay to Botany Bay and the heads. And the initial contact was quite each seeking to know and understand the other, and fairly respectful, except that Cook had already declared that despite the owners being there, that this was England's land. And that's the root of the problem with our Indigenous peoples, because it was the start of dispossession. And it actually got worse because the first fleet arrived in 1787. So that's some 17 years after Cook declared Australia as English property. And they just sailed in with several ships loaded with convicts and set up a convict settlement in Sydney. That convict settlement was followed fairly quickly by Governor Burke. So we had British or English appointed governors sent out. And Governor Burke in 1835 declared Australia to be terra nullius. Terra land nullius, not non-existent, not belonging. In other words, the land was not owned by anyone. And it was this official declaration of terra nullius that led to a further strengthening of the dispossession. The net result of that is that there has never been any form of treaty, any form of recompense, any form of recognition of Indigenous Australians as being the First Nations. We are getting there now, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but up until this point in time, officially, they weren't recognised. Horrifyingly, it wasn't until 1966 that Aboriginal Australians in Australia were recognised as people. Prior to that, they were considered to be flora and fauna, and they were categorised as part of the flora and fauna of the country. So that's coming off a very poor base. Probably other Indigenous peoples have had very difficult times, but I think from my understanding, nobody would have been treated with quite such disdain, to not even recognise them as human beings for such a length of time. 1966 is pretty recent. Took a long time. And, you know, if I was one who believed in carrying shame, I would, but I'm not, because I practice choice theory and I recognise that shame isn't a very productive thing to do. So what I choose to do is to work with people in the Indigenous community to find a way to help them to help themselves. And choice theory is an excellent way to do it, which I'll come to in a minute. The Aboriginal population is estimated, of course, nobody really knows, but it was estimated to be 250,000, roughly, give or take, probably that number again, in 1770. Nobody did a count, they just estimate that it was. It was estimated to have got down as low as around 60,000 by 1920. So that's a loss of nearly 200,000 population. Instead of going up, they disappeared. They died because of poor nutrition. They ate Western food, which their dietary system couldn't handle. Diseases associated with the West. So things like measles could kill an Indigenous person who had no ability, no inbuilt ability to resist that. And unfortunately, and this is part of the shame that I was talking about that you could carry, through massacres. Early settlers, because they were flora and fauna and were attacking their sheep and cattle, felt fully entitled to get rid of the flora and fauna that was causing damage to their property, the sheep and the cattle. And that's what was carried out for a long, long time. So that population plunged to 60,000. I'm delighted to say that it's now back up. Latest estimate as of now, 2021, is that it's reached 713,000. Australia has nearly 26 million. So it's almost 1/26 of the Australian population. So that's good, and it's a growing, healthy environment for them. It's not great at the moment. I'll talk to you about that in a moment too. Initially, there were estimated to be, and this is one of the problems, there were estimated to be around 500 tribal groups, or nations, as they're called. First Nations, and around 250 different languages and customs. So one of the problems is that we've always dealt with the Aboriginal people rather than recognising the Aboriginal peoples. It's not one homogenous group. They don't talk the same language. They don't have the same customs. There are differences between Indigenous peoples of the north, the south, the east and the west. Australia, if anyone has been here, is a vast continent and huge distances. And without modern transport, it's extremely difficult to traverse the whole of it, to cover the whole of it. So that's why you got so many different tribal groups or nations and so many different languages and customs, which in the end meant that they were never going to speak as one. And that's still an issue today, because when one group speaks, they know what they want, but effectively it's very difficult to speak for what another group wants, because that can be quite different. And it's holding back the progress. But we are looking for a way to move through that. And I think we're on the right track. So the biggest problem with our Indigenous culture, and I think this is probably true for most Indigenous cultures that become minorities in countries where European and or other groups have come in and maybe taken over. And it's certainly not Europe, just English that did it. There were many countries around the world that did that throughout history, not just recent history either. But the biggest problem is dispossession. Dispossession of land, or as the Indigenous peoples call it, country, dispossession from country, is huge. The Indigenous peoples in Australia had no sense of ownership, none at all. They never considered that they owned the land. They considered that they were irrevocably connected to the land, hence the connection to country, and hence the connection with custom, spirituality, history, belief system, law, law, L-A-W, and law, L-O-R-E. They have that connection and it's inextricably tied to place. So when dispossession occurs, whilst they don't believe that they don't own the land anymore, they'd never believed they owned it in the first place. But what's happened was they were physically moved. They were, in the view of the groups and government groups at the time, they were forcibly removed from lands and resettled in lands with groups that may not have the same customs or even the same language, which led to all sorts of problems. And with dispossession and that forcible moving, things like poor nutrition, alcoholism, led to a whole generation where kids were not being cared for. And the actions of the ruling people at the time was what has come to be known as the White Australia policy. And this part of it was called assimilation. And assimilation was about saying the best thing we can do for these poor wretches, I'm using their terms, not mine, is to make them white. Mm-hmm. I can't put it any more clearly than that. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, we can look at that as a supreme arrogance and ignorance. We can be as judgmental as we want to be. I don't think it really helps. They did what they believed in at the time, and choice theory teaches us that what we do is what we believe is the best we can do at that particular time. So I'm not going to judge retrospectively, but we can certainly recognise currently that it led to the situation where people were so disconnected that horrible results came. And those results were a decrease in life expectancy. If we go back to those figures, from 250,000 to 60,000, an increase in infant mortality, a decrease in health and health outcomes, a decrease in education and employment and their ability to learn and understand, and a huge increase in incarceration. The leftover results of that now in current Australia at the moment, 29% of our prison population is Indigenous. So that's almost a third is Indigenous. But they really are only around 3% of the population. So you can see that something has gone seriously wrong. And choice theory actually explains that to us. It explains what's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong. So the first thing I'll say is that the current issues in Victoria, Australia, the federal government, we have a federal government and each state has a separate government. The federal government has been talking for decades about a treaty, never has done anything about it. In Victoria, we are in the process now of having an Indigenous assembly, elected, nominated, and wholly run by the Indigenous peoples of Victoria. And what they are coming up with is a treaty that's going to be signed with Victoria. So we are on the way, and that treaty will include reparation, future development, and will be driven by the needs of the group the Indigenous group, which is guiding that treaty process. It will not be run by the government. The government will take advice and will follow that advice to set the treaty up and to set up the accompanying structures to make sure that we get better outcomes. So it's a step in the right direction. So why the difficulty? Glass's needs explain it. When we have dispossession, when we have that disconnection, immediately our survival needs are impacted. You could see that in the figures I gave you. We don't feel safe and secure, whether that be physically or psychologically and emotionally. Our love and belonging needs are severed. When you take people and take them away from their connection to land, which they love and belong to, because you can love and belong to places and things as well as people. You can experience love and belonging with that. And there is a genuine love and belonging with that connection with country. When you sever that, it leaves people struggling to find a way to meet those needs. Freedom goes without saying that if you're not even considered to be a person, your freedom needs are damaged in ways that I can't even really begin to imagine. I can think that I know, but I don't. Without experiencing it, you can't. And someone like me, and I'm what's called by our local Indigenous people a gubbo. And gubbo is Indigenous language it's a shortened version of governor. So it's a nod to the early days where they considered that we were governors and in charge, but it's now almost a derogative term, but sometimes it can be used, depending on the tone of voice, it can be used in a more connected way. So I'm a gubbo. I can't know ever what it's like to be Indigenous. I am Indigenous in one sense, but I'm not a First Nations person. I'm Indigenous. I was born in Australia. My family, mother and father, were born in Australia. My grandparents were born in Australia. My great-grandparents were not. So I'm Indigenous in that sense, but I'm not in the sense of hundreds of thousands of years of connection to land and place. Their need for fun was completely destroyed. So obviously the enjoyment and pleasure part, you're not having much fun when you're being controlled and redirected and punished and experiencing massacres, but also your ability to learn and grow is severely impacted. And we know the effects of trauma on the brain's ability to be able to take in new information and change. And finally, the Indigenous people's power needs. Achievement, recognition, almost impossible, particularly if you're not even recognised as a human being up until 1966. So with the framework of understanding Glass's needs, we can see why the rear wheels of the total behaviour car, hopefully people know what that is, Mona, but the rear wheels of people's total behaviour car are stuck fast because their physiology and their emotional, their feelings, their psychological and emotional feelings are not being met in any way, shape or form. And they continue to not be as the pain of that echoes down the generations. They call it in the mental, I'm going to use the term mental illness industry. They call it in the mental illness industry intergenerational trauma. I think it's a less than useful term because it implies that there's nothing that can be done. It's passed down from generation to generation. I prefer to talk to the Indigenous peoples that I work with about, yes, there is intergenerational disadvantage, but we don't have to keep having it like that. And choice theory shows us how to move out of that. If the focus is on intergenerational trauma and I need you to fix this, it might be another 200 years before anything is done about it. So it's time for our Indigenous peoples, individually and collectively, to take charge of their lives. And that's what I teach them when I'm working with choice theory. And they get it. Choice theory is an absolute international language. It's one that anybody, anywhere can understand. So the focus has been in my individual counselling, working with people, and I teach them choice theory. And they go out and they grab life by the scruff of the neck and they can be successful. And they can go on and do master's degrees at university, working in the white man's environment, the European culture, but being successful in it and taking that success back and showing the younger Indigenous peoples that, yes, there is intergenerational disadvantage, but let's not call it trauma and say we can't do anything about it. Let's call it for what it is, which is passed down disadvantage caused by alcoholism or poor hygiene or just the learning, the inability to see that there's another way that we can be, the whole encompassing picture. When you break that down and you help people to understand and they start to thrive, we don't want just survival. I talked about that last week. We want thriving. And the people that I can work with or have worked with are able to do that. And the net result is that not only do they lift themselves, the people around them who see what they're doing say, how did you do that? What are you doing? And they can share that. So part of my mission in life, and I want to stay away from the term missionary because they did a lot of damage here early on for what they thought was the right reasons, not judgmental on that, but it was damaging. But my mission is, as Glasser said, to change the world with choice theory. And there's no reason why that can't work. And I successfully have proved it does work, working both individually and collectively with Indigenous groups. In the future is I want to develop with some Indigenous partners a program of training that they will take out to the Indigenous communities, because when a Gubbo speaks, it's still seen with some, I guess, caution. It takes a long time to build trust with peoples who've been so abused in the past, because the expectation is that you're going to do them in somewhere along the line. So that's my journey. It's a hopeful one. I wanted to give you where it's come from, and I know that can seem a bit depressing, but it's also uplifting to realise that we don't have to just accept that just because that's the way it was, there's nothing we can do about it. There's things we can do about it right here, right now. And what I've been doing in sharing that with Indigenous peoples proves it, because they go out and change things. I don't. It's not me. The only thing I can do is give the information as clearly as I can by developing that relationship with them where they trust me enough to take it on board and give it a crack. So that's the story, Mona. I might leave it to people now to ask some questions.
Well, covered the history beautifully. And it was, did you say, was that 1996 or 66 that people were still seen as flora and fauna?
Yeah, no, it's 1966.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That is sad, sad, sad. And not only is it sad to know that it's there, I mean, there's a lot of things like that going on here in America of needing to rewrite a lot of history and to give dignity back to people. I mean, they already have it because
Yes.
it's a universal dignity of the human spirit. But for we, the rest of we, the people, regardless of who it is, to understand that and to acknowledge the fact. And whenever you were talking about that they were not to carry their shame, I appreciated that somewhere in there you talked about acknowledging the fact that it was a shame, but you don't have to wear it. You don't have to buy
Don't
into it.
have to carry it. Exactly.
Right, 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 right. So sounds like you've made great strides.
It's been honestly it's an honor to be accepted by the community, because it does take a lot of trust to do that. It's a fragile thing, but we know that in choice theory, relationships are everything.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Well, we're going to stop the recording and thank everyone, for those that were here live and also those that watch it later. And thank you for watching. And our programs are always insightful and often entertaining. And we hope that you will join us each week for making sense of it. In the meantime, have a great week and a great life and good mental health.
Bye-bye.